The words were still in the air when she picked up her bag. Abigail didn't run. She'd promised herself years ago she would never run from anything again. Not from her mother's house in Cincinnati. Not from the boyfriend who called her dramatic every time she cried, and certainly not from a man who wore silence like a second skin. She walked. Steady steps, heels against the marble floor of Jihoon's Chicago penthouse office, each sound too loud in a room that had gone completely still. She didn't look back. That was the part she kept returning to, weeks later. The fact that she hadn't looked back. Not once. Not even when she heard his chair shift, the small sound of movement behind her, the almost imperceptible exhale that could have meant anything. She just kept walking, past the glass desk with the single lamp, past the wall of monitors no one else was ever allowed to face, past the two men stationed near the elevator who stepped aside without a word, their eyes fixed forward, as if they'd been trained to be furniture when it suited him. The elevator doors closed. She stared at her own reflection in the polished steel and thought, that's it then. It hadn't always felt like that, like something ending. For 2 years, Abigail had been Jihoon's personal assistant, a title that barely scratched the surface of what the job actually required. She managed his calendar, yes. She handled correspondence in 3 languages, screened calls, coordinated meetings across 4 time zones, and maintained the particular kind of professional discretion that wasn't listed in any job description, but was absolutely the first thing you understood when you walked through the door of KSH Consulting Group's private floor on the 42nd story of a building in the West Loop. KSH Consulting. That was what the glass placard said. That was what the tax filings said. That was what Abigail had believed, briefly, before she stopped asking questions and started paying attention instead. She'd been 27 when she took the job. A temp placement, a mistake, her agency later admitted. Someone had checked the wrong box on a form and sent her up there instead of to a law firm 2 floors below. By the time the mix-up was discovered, Jihoon had already looked at her resume, asked her one question, and told the agency she was staying. She never learned what question he'd asked himself in that moment. She never asked. That was the thing about working for Jihoon Kwan. You got very good at not asking. His presence filled a room before he entered it. Abigail had noticed that on her first day and every day after. It wasn't about the security, the 2 men who moved like shadows at a careful distance, the third who was never seen but always implied. It wasn't the suit, though his suits were the kind that made the air around him look cheaper by comparison. It was something else, a density, a gravitational shift that made people straighten their spines and lower their voices before they even registered that he'd walked in. She'd watched it happen at restaurants, at private events in River North, at the sort of quiet hotel conference rooms where powerful men spoke in careful half-sentences and shook hands that meant more than contracts. She'd watched people who frightened her, people she instinctively understood operated outside the visible edges of the law, go soft and respectful in his presence. Not afraid, exactly. Something more complicated than fear. Jihoon himself remained unchanged. He was 29 when she met him, 30 when she stopped pretending she didn't notice the way certain rooms became different with him in them. His face was composed in the way that took discipline, not coldness exactly, but control so deep it looked like stillness. He spoke in short sentences. He asked precise questions. He never raised his voice. She'd heard raised voices from the rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. She'd seen the aftermath once, of something she'd had no context for, and had learned not to seek context for. She wasn't naive. She understood, in the peripheral, careful way that let her sleep at night, what KSH Consulting Group actually was. She stayed anyway. She told herself it was the salary, that it was the apartment stipend and the car service and the health insurance, and the simple fact that no other job had ever made her feel like her mind was being used properly. She told herself many things in those 2 years. The night it broke was a Tuesday in November. Not a dramatic night. Not a night with weather or occasion. Abigail had stayed late to prepare briefing materials for a meeting the following morning, something involving a real estate acquisition that had more layers than it showed on paper. The office had emptied by 9. By 10:30, she was the only one left on the floor, and by the time she knocked on the inner office door to leave the files, it was past 11. She should have slid them under the door. She knew that. She'd done it before. Instead, she knocked, and he said, "Come in." And she walked into the amber light of his desk lamp to find him with his jacket off, collar open, the ink of the tattoos at his neck, darker in that low light, a glass of whiskey half gone at his elbow. He looked at her the way he sometimes did when he thought she wasn't paying attention, with something unguarded in it, something she didn't have a name for. She set the files on the desk, and then, because she was tired, because November had been long, because she'd made the mistake of letting 2 years of proximity feel like something it wasn't, she said quietly, "I think I've started to care about this too much." She hadn't even meant him, specifically. She'd meant the job, the world, the whole complicated weight of knowing too much and choosing to stay. But the words landed wrong, or right, or somewhere that couldn't be taken back. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Jehoon said, without expression, without cruelty, just the flat delivery of something he apparently considered a fact, "I never loved you." She picked up her bag. She walked out. She didn't look back. The apartment she went to that night was a sublet in Pilsen. She'd kept quietly for 8 months, a small thing with second-hand furniture and windows that faced a brick wall, paid for with a portion of her salary that she'd always told herself was savings and had understood, somewhere deeper, was an exit plan. She sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street. Twice. She told herself that was nothing. Just Chicago in November. Just traffic. She pulled her knees to her chest, pressed her back against the cold wall, and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done, which was leave, which was right, which hurt in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't properly explain to herself, and which she understood with complete, terrible clarity was not over. Men like Jehoon Kwan didn't lose things. She wasn't sure he knew how. She lasted 4 days before she turned her phone back on, not because she was waiting for him. That's what she told herself while the device charged on the kitchen counter, while she watched the little battery icon climb from 0, while she stood there in an oversized sweatshirt at 7 in the morning, drinking coffee that tasted like nothing. She turned it on because she needed to call her landlord about a broken radiator, because she had a dentist appointment to reschedule, because the world didn't pause for the kind of pain that didn't have a clean name. The phone lit up with 43 notifications. None of them were from Jehoon. She didn't know if that made it better or worse. She stood there long enough for her coffee to go cold, scrolling through the backlog, texts from her friend Danielle asking if she was alive, 2 voicemails from a number she didn't recognize, a calendar reminder for a meeting she no longer had any reason to attend. She deleted the reminder. She stared at the empty space it left on the screen. None of them were from him. She put the phone face down on the counter and went to shower. Danielle came over on Thursday with wine and the particular energy of someone who had decided not to ask questions, but was absolutely going to ask questions. She was tall and sharp-tongued and worked in healthcare logistics and had been Abigail's closest friend since college, which meant she was one of the only people who knew the broad strokes of where Abigail worked. Not the details, never the details, but enough to have said, more than once over the past 2 years, "Abby, I need you to think carefully about what you're building your life around." She didn't say that now. She poured wine, sat cross-legged on the second-hand couch, and waited. Abigail told her most of it. Not the parts that couldn't be spoken, but the rest. The late nights, the accumulated proximity, the way she'd let herself believe that because he looked at her differently than he looked at everyone else. It meant something. The way she'd said what she said, the way he'd answered. Danielle was quiet for a moment. Then, He said he never loved you. Yeah. Those exact words. Yeah. Danielle turned her wine glass slowly between her palms. That's a weird thing to say to someone who didn't ask. Abigail opened her mouth, closed it. She'd been circling that same thought for 4 days and hadn't been able to land on it the way Danielle just had, simply and without ceremony. She hadn't asked. She'd said something ambiguous about caring too much, and he had answered a question she hadn't technically posed, which meant he'd heard it anyway, which meant somewhere in the flat, controlled architecture of him, he had been thinking about it too. She poured more wine and decided not to follow that thought to its conclusion. She found a new job faster than she expected. A contact she'd built during her time at KSH, carefully, at a distance, the way you built everything in that world, connected her to a private events firm in the Gold Coast that handled corporate functions for clients with money and discretion requirements. The job was coordinator level, not the scope she'd had before, but it was clean. The office was small. Nobody wore tattoos under their collars. The most ethically complicated thing she encountered in her first week was a catering dispute. She took it. She got up every morning, put on her coat, rode the bus because she no longer had a car service, and went to work in a building where the elevator music was gentle, and nobody moved like a shadow. She answered emails about floral arrangements and venue contracts and dietary restrictions, and she was competent at it, and she didn't feel like her mind was being used properly, and she told herself that was fine. That was November into December. The city shifted into holiday lights, the kind that made Chicago look like it was trying to apologize for the cold. She walked through them on her lunch breaks and felt, mostly, like a person who was healing. Like someone who had made the right choice and was living inside the early, uncomfortable part of it, where right didn't feel like anything yet. She almost believed it. The first sign was the flowers. A delivery arrived at her new office. No card, white ranunculus in a matte black box, the kind of arrangement that cost what her grocery budget was for 2 weeks. Her coworker Priya raised an eyebrow. Secret admirer. Abigail stared at the box and felt the hairs on her forearm rise under her sleeve. She threw them away before she reached her desk. The second sign was the man outside her building. She noticed him on a Wednesday evening, not because he was doing anything, but because he was doing nothing with too much deliberateness. Standing near the corner in a dark coat, hands in his pockets, facing the street, she'd seen enough of Jehoon's world to recognize a stationed person. Someone placed, not passing. She walked past him without slowing and locked her apartment door and sat on the edge of her bed, with her heart moving too fast, and she thought, he's watching. Not Jehoon. Jehoon didn't stand on corners in the dark, but someone who answered to him. She wasn't sure if she felt threatened or something she couldn't afford to name. The event that ended the distance between them was not one she chose. Her new firm was hired to coordinate a private dinner. 40 guests, a venue in River North, the kind of evening where the client list wasn't discussed openly, and the catering staff signed additional NDAs. Abigail had been assigned lead coordinator almost by accident. Her supervisor had a family emergency 2 days before, and there was no time to reassign the account. She told herself the city was large. She told herself River North had dozens of private venues. She told herself the overlap was statistically unlikely. She walked in at 5:30 for setup and saw the security arrangement near the private entrance and understood immediately that she'd been wrong. For a moment, she stood very still in the middle of the room, a clipboard in her hand, caterers moving around her, and she calculated her options. She could leave. She could call her supervisor and manufacture a reason. She could do her job, stay in the operational areas, and avoid the main room once guests arrived. She chose the third option, professionalism over instinct, or maybe pride. She wasn't entirely sure. For 3 hours it worked. She managed the kitchen coordination, the table arrangements, the small cascading emergencies that every event produced. She kept her eyes on what was in front of her. She was good at her job. She forgot, almost where she was. Then a hand touched her arm. Not his hand. One of his men, the one called Ryun, who she'd learned over 2 years was the closest thing Jihoon had to a right hand, and who now stood next to her in the corridor outside the main hall, with an expression that communicated nothing except intent. He'd like a word. Abigail looked at Ryun for a long moment. The clipboard was cold in her grip. "I'm working," she said. "So is he," Ryun said, in a tone that didn't argue, just stated. She followed him. The room he led her to was small and separated from the main event, a private sitting area with 2 chairs and a low table, and a window that faced the dark street below. Jihoon stood with his back to the door, looking out. He heard her come in. He didn't turn immediately, and in those few seconds she had time to register that he looked the same. Composed, still, that gravitational density unchanged, and that something in her chest responded to his presence in a way she resented completely. He turned. He looked at her the way he sometimes had in those quiet late hours in the office, with something that didn't belong on the face of a man who had said what he'd said, something that sat beneath the control and pressed against it from the inside. "You left," he said. She held the clipboard like it was armor. "You told me to." He hadn't, technically. She knew that. The quiet that followed knew it too. He hadn't told her to leave. They both knew that. The silence in that small room was different from the silences she'd learned to navigate in 2 years of working beside him. Those had been functional. The quiet of a man thinking, deciding, processing information faster than most people spoke. This one had texture. It pressed against the walls. It made the space between them feel like something that could be measured. Abigail didn't fill it. She'd learned that from him, actually. The discipline of not speaking first. Jihoon moved away from the window. Not toward her, just away from it, a small repositioning, as if the city at his back had become inconvenient. He was in a dark suit, no tie, collar just slightly open in the way that was somehow more formal on him than buttoned would have been on anyone else. The tattoos at his neck disappeared into fabric. She kept her eyes level. "This firm," he said. "How long have you been with them?" "That's what you want to ask me." It wasn't quite a question. He looked at her with something that might have flickered, briefly, at the edges of his composure. "No," he said. "It isn't." Another silence. Abigail felt the clipboard edge cutting into her palm and loosened her grip. "Then ask what you actually want to ask," she said, and was surprised by how steady her voice came out. She didn't feel steady. She felt like the floor had a slight tilt she was compensating for with every muscle she had. Jihoon looked at her for a long moment. There was something in it, an assessment that went past professional, past the cataloging of information that she'd always associated with the way his mind worked. Something more specific than that, more personal, though he would probably never use that word. "You're safe," he said finally. She blinked. "I didn't ask. The man outside your building is there because I put him there. He's not a threat. You don't need to worry about the building." The coldness that moved through her was not entirely anger. "You've been having me watched, protected. I didn't ask for that." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He said it without apology, which was infuriating, and without the particular arrogance she might have expected, which was worse. He said it the way he said most things, like a fact he'd already reconciled himself with, like the decision had been made somewhere internal, and he was simply reporting its existence. She wanted to tell him to remove whoever he had stationed outside her building. She wanted to say that she wasn't his employee anymore, wasn't his anything, and that whatever he believed his responsibilities were, they ended the night she walked out of his elevator. She had the sentences ready. Instead, she heard herself say, quietly and against her better judgment, "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. The sounds of the event filtered through the wall, Low music, the percussion of glassware, the collective low register of 40 people performing wealth and discretion for each other. "Because you left," he said, "and I let you, and that was a mistake." She didn't stay in that room. She told herself later that she'd handled it well, that she'd said she needed to get back to work, that she'd held the line, that she'd walked out of that room with the same steadiness she'd walked out of his penthouse 3 weeks ago. All of that was true. She had done those things. She'd returned to the kitchen corridor and managed the final 2 hours of the event with clean professionalism. And she'd packed up, signed out, and taken the elevator down with her coat buttoned and her jaw set. But his words rode home with her on the bus. "I let you, and that was a mistake." Not, "I was wrong to say what I said." Not, "I'm sorry." Not even the simple human acknowledgement that something had happened that deserved acknowledgement. Just that strange, unvarnished admission, structured like a tactical reassessment rather than an apology, and somehow more affecting for it, because she'd spent 2 years learning to read him, and she understood that for Ji-hoon Kwan, admitting a mistake, even obliquely, even in that compressed, controlled way, was not nothing. It cost him something. She'd heard it in the half-second before he spoke. She stared out the bus window at the holiday lights blurring past in the rain, and hated that she understood him as well as she did. Danielle called it a trap. Not maliciously, she clarified, pouring tea in Abigail's kitchen 2 days later. "I don't think he's sitting around plotting. But men like that, and I'm saying men like that not as a type, but as a specific category of person who has never had to work for anything that mattered to them emotionally, they don't know how to want something until it's gone. And then when it's gone, they mistake the wanting for something deeper than it is." Abigail turned her mug in her hands. "You don't know him." "No," Danielle said, "but I know you. And I know that you've spent 2 years making yourself smaller so that you'd fit correctly inside someone else's structure. I watched you do it. You thought you were being professional. You were disappearing." The words landed somewhere Abigail didn't have a ready defense for. "I wasn't—" "You threw away flowers without even finding out if they were from him. You didn't call me when you left. You turned your phone off for 4 days. You took a job that you told me yourself is half of what you're capable of. Also, you could be somewhere he wasn't." Danielle set down her mug. "That's not healing. That's hiding." The radiator knocked. Outside, the December rain had stiffened toward sleet. Abigail didn't say anything for a while. Then, "He had someone watching my building." Danielle's expression shifted. "Watching?" "Protecting." He said protecting. The silence that followed was a different kind. The kind where both of them understood they were at the edge of something neither could fully evaluate from where they stood. "Abi," Danielle said carefully, "you need to decide what you actually want, not what's safe, not what makes sense, what you want." What she wanted was not a simple question. She wanted the version of those 2 years that hadn't required her to quarantine so much of herself. She wanted to be looked at the way he sometimes looked at her, without the cost of never being able to ask what it meant. She wanted to matter to someone in a way that was said out loud, plainly, without requiring her to decode it like a language she'd had to teach herself. She wanted uncomplicated warmth, and she had spent 2 years in the orbit of a man who was the precise opposite of that. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped wanting simple things because she'd gotten too used to the complicated one. She knew this about herself. She'd known it for a while. What she hadn't known, what arrived quietly one morning as she was getting ready for work, looking at herself in the bathroom mirror with toothbrush in hand, was that she was angry. Not sad, not bruised, not cautiously hopeful. Angry. At the wasted time, at the managed distances, at the way he'd said those 4 words like they were a service. Like clarity was the same as kindness. She was angry at herself too, for staying so long in something that asked everything and named nothing. and she was angry because she was still thinking about him, still metabolizing his words from that corridor in River North, still feeling the pull of him like something she hadn't finished yet. She spat, rinsed, looked at herself. She decided she wasn't going to hide anymore. She called Ryun. She still had the number. She'd had every number once. She wasn't sure Ryun would pick up for someone who no longer worked for KSH, but he answered on the second ring, and she kept it brief. She said she needed 20 minutes with Ji-hoon, somewhere neutral, somewhere she chose. Not his office, not an event. A place where she held at least half the ground. Ryun said he'd pass it along. She expected to wait days. She expected conditions, renegotiations. The particular elaborate indirectness of men who arranged everything in advance. He called her himself within the hour. She stood in her kitchen and stared at his name on her screen for 3 full seconds before she answered. His voice was the same. Level. Unhurried. Like he had all the time in the world and was choosing to spend it here. Name the place, he said. She told him. A coffee shop in Logan Square, the following morning. 9 o'clock. Small, public, close to her apartment. Ground she understood. All right, he said. Just that. No negotiation. She hadn't expected that either. She put the phone down and stood very still for a moment, aware that she'd just done something that couldn't be walked back. The room was quiet. The sleet had stopped. Somewhere outside, she suspected, someone in a dark coat was standing near the corner. For the first time in 3 weeks, that didn't make her feel watched. It made her feel like she was about to walk into something with her eyes open. She got there first. On purpose. The coffee shop was called Mira's, a narrow place with exposed brick and mismatched chairs and the kind of permanently fogged windows that made the outside world look soft and uncertain. Abigail had been coming here since she moved to the neighborhood. The woman behind the counter knew her order. The corner table near the back was almost always empty on weekday mornings, and she took it now, unwound her scarf, set her coat on the chair beside her, and ordered a black coffee she wasn't sure she could drink without her hands giving her away. She was calm. She told herself she was calm. At 8:57, the atmosphere of the room changed. It was the same thing she'd observed 100 times in 100 different settings. But it still caught her off guard. The way the 2 men near the door reoriented almost imperceptibly. The way the barista's chatter stopped mid-sentence and then resumed a note higher. The way the couple at the window table both straightened without seeming to notice they'd done it. The bell above the door rang once. Ji-hoon came in alone. That surprised her. Or rather, he appeared to come in alone. She understood by now that alone was a performance he was capable of, that the actual architecture of his security was rarely visible. But he crossed the coffee shop without the usual perimeter. No Ryun, no shadow at a careful distance, just him in a charcoal coat with his collar up against the December cold, and he looked like anyone. Almost. He looked like anyone if you didn't know how to look at him. He found her immediately. She didn't know why she'd expected otherwise. He sat down across from her, unbuttoned his coat, and said nothing for a moment. Just looked at her with that focused, measuring attention that she'd spent 2 years being the subject of and had never fully gotten used to. The tattoos at his throat were half visible above his collar. His hands on the table were still. The barista appeared and he ordered coffee without looking at the menu, without looking at the barista. His eyes staying on Abigail, in a way that was not aggressive, but was completely unapologetic. "You look tired," he said. "Good morning to you too." Something shifted at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile. She could count on one hand the number of times she'd seen him actually smile. But adjacent to it, the acknowledgement of it. "Good morning, Abigail." She had prepared things to say, organized them, even, which she recognized as an old professional habit. The briefing document version of a conversation. Points in order, language precise. She'd planned to open with the surveillance, make her position clear, establish terms before allowing anything else into the room. She'd planned to be controlled. Instead, she said, "Why did you say it like that?" He waited. "That night. You could have said anything. You could have said nothing. But you said it like it was a fact you were tired of carrying around." She kept her voice even, like telling me would make it lighter. Jihoon looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough to make the ambient noise of the coffee shop feel very far away. "Because I thought it was true," he said. She opened her mouth. "At the time," he added quietly, "I thought if I said it plainly enough, it would be true." The coffee arrived. Neither of them touched it. Abigail sat with what he'd just said and felt it rearrange something inside her chest. Not fixing anything, not making the previous weeks disappear, but changing the shape of what she'd been carrying. He had said those words as a decision, as something he'd been trying to make real by speaking it aloud, which meant the thing he'd been trying to kill had existed before he tried to kill it. She wasn't sure if that made it better. She was sure it made it more complicated. "That's a terrible thing to do to someone," she said. "Yes." The directness of it, no qualification, no redirect, caught her off guard. She'd expected deflection. She'd expected the composed architectural silence he used when he didn't want to concede ground. Not this. Not the flat, clean admission that sat on the table between them like something he'd decided, before walking in, that he owed her. "I'm not asking you to come back to KSH, he said. "I'm not asking you to come back to anything. I'm asking you to let me—" He stopped. The pause was brief but visible, the smallest evidence of a man who rarely didn't know the next word. "I'm asking you to let me say this correctly." She waited. "I've been careful my whole life," he said, "with everything. Careful about what I show, what I want, who I allow close enough to matter. It's not strategy. It's the way I'm built. The way this life built me." His eyes stayed on hers, steady. "You were close enough to matter for a long time before I admitted it to myself. And when you said what you said that night, I panicked." The word hung in the air between them. She couldn't have imagined him using it. "You panicked," she repeated. "I pushed you out before I could—" Another stop. "Before it became something I couldn't manage." Abigail looked at him across the small table in the fogged window coffee shop and understood, with the particular clarity that came from too much accumulated honesty in a short span of time, that she was at a precise fork. She could take what he'd said and fold it into the story she'd already been living. The story where she was someone who stayed too long in complicated things, who mistook intensity for depth, who deserved simpler, and she could walk out of Mira's and get on with the smaller, cleaner life she'd been constructing in Logan Square. Or she could say the true thing. "I wasn't asking you to love me that night," she said. "I was telling you I'd already let it go too far on my side. I was trying to be honest. I wasn't asking for anything back." "I know," he said, "but you answered anyway." "I know, which means you'd been thinking about it." She held his gaze. "Which means it wasn't as simple as you made it sound." He didn't deny it. He lifted his coffee finally, took a measured sip, set it down. The ordinariness of the gesture in the context of everything else made something loosen slightly in her chest. "What do you want?" she asked him. "Not what you're trying to manage. What do you actually want?" The question sat between them. She watched him receive it, watched the discipline of his face hold, and then, quietly, relax a fraction. Not collapse, nothing so dramatic, just a small yielding, like a door that had been slightly ajar the whole time finally acknowledged the draft. "You," he said. Plain, undecorated. She didn't say yes that morning. She needed him to understand that. She told him she needed time, real time, not the managed waiting of a man accustomed to outcomes he controlled. She told him the surveillance ended today, not tomorrow, not when it felt right to him today. She told him she wasn't going to be watched, even protectively, without her knowledge and her consent. She told him that if anything was going to be different, then everything had to be different. And that different meant she was a person in his life, not a position in his structure. He listened to all of it without interrupting. That alone cost her something, because she was used to being interrupted in proportion to how much someone disagreed, and his silence wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence of a man absorbing. "The protection," he said when she'd finished. "There are people in my world who know you existed near me. That doesn't disappear because you left the job." She'd thought about this. "Then tell me, don't hide it. If there's a reason for concern, I want to know what it is, and I want a say in how it's handled." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not how I've operated." "I know," she said. "That's what I'm asking you to change." The coffee shop hummed around them. Someone laughed near the window. The December light through the fogged glass was pale and diffuse, the kind that made everything look like it was still deciding what it wanted to be. Ji-hoon nodded once. It was small. It was not nothing. She wrapped her hands around her mug and felt the warmth of it move up through her palms, and she thought that this was the part no one prepared you for. Not the dramatic rupture, not the charged reunion, but the quiet, difficult, necessary negotiation of two people deciding, with full information, whether they were willing to try. She was scared. She was clear-eyed. She was still angry, underneath, in the way she suspected would take longer than a coffee shop conversation to dissolve. But she was tired of hiding. Danielle had been right about that. "Call off the man on my corner," she said. "Today, and then call me. We'll figure out the rest." She stood, pulled on her coat, unwound her scarf from the chair. He stayed seated, watching her with that particular attention that she had spent 2 years trying not to feel and had never succeeded at. The tattoos at his throat, the composed set of his jaw, the hands still on the table. "Abigail," he said as she turned. She looked back. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the way I said it." 4 words to answer 4 words. She held them for a moment, let them settle where they needed to go. Then she walked out into the cold Chicago morning, and this time she knew he was watching, and this time she let him. He called at 6:17 that evening. Abigail was in the middle of making dinner. Nothing significant, just pasta and a jar of sauce she'd been meaning to use for a week, when her phone lit up on the counter. She looked at it for 1 full ring, then she picked up. "It's done," he said. "The corner, all of it." She exhaled slowly, stirring the pot. "Thank you." A brief silence, not uncomfortable, the kind that had its own shape. "Are you home?" he asked. "Yes." "Good." Another pause, and then, with a deliberateness she recognized as him choosing the words carefully. "I want to do this right. I don't entirely know what that looks like. But I want to." She leaned against the counter. Outside her window, the brick wall was dark, and for the first time in weeks she looked at it without cataloging who might be standing below. "Neither do I," she said honestly. "I think that's probably the right place to start." She heard something shift on his end. Not quite a breath, not quite a word. Just the small sound of a man who had spent his entire life inside, carefully maintained control, allowing the edges of something softer to exist for a moment. "Dinner tomorrow," he said. "Somewhere you choose." She almost said something sharp about whether that was a question or a directive, and then she decided to let it go, because she'd heard the effort underneath it, and because she understood by now that some things about him would change slowly, and some things perhaps not at all, and she needed to know which was which before she decided what she could live with. "I'll send you the address," she said. December moved toward its end. They had dinner, then another. Not at the kind of establishments she'd attended as his assistant. Not the hushed private rooms with security at the door and conversations that meant more than they sounded. A Thai place in Wicker Park, where the tables were too close together and the music was too loud, and Ji-hoon sat with his coat on for the first 15 minutes, looking like a man who had arrived on the wrong planet. A wine bar in Andersonville, where someone recognized her from college and stopped to say hello, and she watched Ji-hoon go very still beside her with the particular stillness of a man recalibrating, absorbing the existence of her life outside of him. She introduced him by name. No title, no context. Just Ji-hoon. He looked at her afterward with something she couldn't immediately classify. Later, walking back to her building through the cold, she understood it had been surprise. The genuine, unguarded kind. "You didn't explain me," he said. "Why would I?" He was quiet for half a block. "People usually want to explain me. People usually know who you are before they meet you," she said. "She just met you." He considered that. She watched him turn it over, this small ordinary thing, being introduced as a person rather than a presence, and she understood it had been a while since anyone had done it. Maybe longer than a while. They stopped at the door of her building. The street was quiet, cold, the kind of Chicago winter night that had weight to it. He stood close enough that she could see his breath and hers making separate small clouds in the dark. "Come up," she said. Not an impulsive decision. She'd been deciding it for 2 blocks. He came up. She wasn't naive about what he was. She never had been. Over the following week she learned more. Not because he offered everything freely, but because she asked and he answered. And the answering was its own kind of change. Halting at first, then more deliberate, like a man practicing a thing he'd forgotten he knew how to do. There were parts of his life she would never be fully inside. She understood that. The structure of his world was not something that dismantled, because 2 people decided to be honest over coffee in Logan Square, and she didn't ask him to pretend otherwise. What she asked for was simpler and harder than that. She asked to be told the truth when it touched her. She asked not to be managed. She asked to be seen as someone with full standing, not someone who needed to be protected from information for her own good. He gave her that. Not perfectly, not without friction, not without the occasional evening where she watched him choose silence out of habit and then visibly reconsider and speak instead. But he gave it. She could see the effort in it, and she respected the effort more than she would have respected effortless ease, because ease would have meant he hadn't had to change. He had to change. He was changing. Slowly and with the particular stubbornness of a man who'd built himself into a fixed shape, but changing. Ryun observed all of this with the expression of a man who had worked for Ji-hoon for 7 years and had never seen him order takeout and sit on someone else's couch watching a movie he'd already admitted he didn't understand. Abigail had run into Ryun at Ji-hoon's River North apartment one evening in January. She was there for the first time, learning the space, understanding the way he lived in it, which was sparsely, and with everything in its exact place. Ryun had looked at her with something she couldn't read at first, and then she'd realized it was respect. Not the careful, functional respect of someone managing a situation. Something more genuine. "He's been better," Ryun said quietly, while Ji-hoon was in the other room. "Since..." She didn't ask him to elaborate. She understood what he meant. The thing that had broken between them in November finished its healing somewhere in early February. Not with an event, not with a declaration. Abigail had stopped expecting resolutions to announce themselves by then. It happened on a Sunday morning. Gray, unremarkable, the city outside his window, doing nothing in particular. When she was reading on his couch with her feet tucked under her, and he came and sat beside her with his coffee and his phone, and they existed in the same silence for an hour without it costing either of them anything. She looked at him at some point. He wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He was looking at her, and he wasn't trying to make it mean less than it did. "What?" she said, without looking up from her book. "Nothing," he said. But he reached over and put his hand over hers, unhurried, like a man who had finally stopped pretending he didn't want to. She turned the page. She never went back to KSH. That was a line she'd drawn and held, and he'd respected it, which still sometimes surprised her, the way respect from him surprised her. Not because she thought he was incapable of it, but because she understood what it cost someone who controlled everything to relinquish a corner of that control deliberately and without resentment. She stayed at the events firm through spring, then accepted a senior position at a hospitality group in the West Loop that used her properly, that gave her a team and a budget and problems worth solving. She was good at it. She went home at the end of the day feeling like herself, which turned out to be something she hadn't felt consistently in longer than 2 years. Danielle met Jehoon in March at dinner, and was polite in the precise and watchful way that meant she was reserving judgment while collecting data. Afterward, she told Abigail, "He looks at you like he's afraid you'll disappear." Abigail thought about that for a long time. "Good," she said finally. "He should know what that feels like." Danielle laughed, then more carefully, "Is it enough, Abby? All of it?" She thought about the Sunday mornings, about being introduced as just a person, about a man learning to speak instead of choosing silence, imperfectly and consistently, which was better than perfectly and once. She thought about what she'd wanted before him and what she wanted now, and whether those two things were in conflict. "Yeah," she said, "it's enough." She thought sometimes about that night in November. The marble floors, the amber lamp, the 4 words that had sent her into the cold. She understood now that he'd been trying to protect something by saying them. Not her, but himself. The careful architecture of a man who'd decided years ago that wanting things too much made you vulnerable, and vulnerable made you dead. She understood it, and she didn't excuse it, and she'd said so, plainly, in ways he'd heard. But she also understood that the same fear that had made him say it had made him call off every shadow, sit in a too-loud Thai restaurant, introduce himself as only his name, put his hand over hers on a quiet Sunday, and leave it there. The words he'd said that night were not the whole truth. He'd known that when he said them. She knew it now. What was true was simpler, and had taken longer than it should have to become visible. She mattered to him in the specific, irreplaceable way that changes a person whether they want to be changed or not. He had tried to outrun it. He hadn't managed to. Neither had she. She was glad. On a Thursday evening in April, walking back from dinner through the first real warmth of the season, the city finally releasing the cold it had held since October, Jehoon stopped on the sidewalk and looked at her with that unguarded expression she'd come to know as the one he hadn't learned to hide yet. "What?" she said, smiling slightly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I love you." Plain, undecorated, like a fact he'd finished carrying alone and had decided, finally, to set down somewhere it could be shared. Abigail looked at him in the April evening light. This complicated, controlled, slowly opening man who had once tried to end something with 4 words and was now beginning it again with 3. She took his hand. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She felt his hand tighten around hers, just slightly, the smallest possible evidence of a man who had spent his whole life holding everything carefully, finally allowing himself to hold one thing close. They walked. The city moved around them, ordinary and indifferent and full of light.